I was recently on a cruise ship for a week, and I had no idea that we would be trapped at sea for 7 nights with 10,000 people on board. This was an absolute nightmare scenario for someone like me who does not like crowds. But because of all the cruise deals happening right now, this is actually more common than you think, and there are so many things that you need to know about being stuck on a cruise ship if you're going to do it. The first thing that you need to understand is how busy the cruise ship is when it is fully loaded. It can be really difficult to imagine when you're rewatching TV shows about cruise ships or you're re-looking at photos online. But I promise you, in reality, it is absolutely insane. So, for example, on this particular cruise ship, there are 20 passenger decks. They can carry 5,400 passengers and crew. In my case, they were running at about 90% capacity. And so we had around 10,000 people on board, which means around 5,100 passengers, 4,900 crew members. And what you have to keep in mind is that the ratio of crew to passengers is nowhere near 1-to-1. In fact, it's much lower than that. So the number of crew members on a cruise ship is relatively small compared to the number of guests. On this particular cruise ship, we had around 4,900 crew members, which means for every 100 passengers on board, there were only around 9 crew members. So the crew members work incredibly hard to keep everything running smoothly for everyone, and they do a great job. But you have to realize that they're absolutely slammed. So for example, if you look at something like a restaurant on a cruise ship, I'm talking about the main dining room. Usually in order to get into the dining room and be seated, you don't just walk up and sit down. You have to wait in line and you have to be seated by a host. And so the hosts are sitting people as quickly as they can, but there's a lot of waiting involved. And that goes for pretty much everything on the cruise ship. The pools, the hot tubs, the restaurants, the bars, the clubs, the entertainment venues. Everything is packed, and there's a lot of waiting involved. So let me give you some advice on how to deal with these crowds. First of all, try to go during the shoulder seasons. What I mean by that is to try to go before or after the peak times. For example, on most cruise ships, the busiest time is between 5 and 8 o'clock in the evening. After 8 o'clock, things calm down quite a bit. So, if you're able to go on a cruise and maybe go out to dinner at 8:30 or 9 o'clock, then it'll be much less busy. Same thing with going on excursions. If you go on the popular excursions that are offered by the cruise line, they tend to be much busier than some of the other ones. So consider booking an excursion that isn't as well known. When it comes to getting around the cruise ship, one thing that you can do is instead of waiting for the elevator, you can always take the stairs. On our cruise ship, we found that the stairs were much faster than waiting for the elevator and then waiting for the elevator to unload. So that saved us a lot of time. Another thing to keep in mind is that even though you might be able to get a spot at the pool, during the day, it is very difficult to find a spot at the pool at night, because those areas stay open late into the evening. And so the same thing applies to the hot tubs. If you want to use the hot tub at night, you might be waiting for a while to get a spot. But there's another big problem associated with having too many people on a cruise ship, and that's the food. So what I found is that whenever you have a large number of people in any kind of venue where you have to serve them food, the quality tends to decrease. So the way that this works on a cruise ship is that you have set dining times. So there's early, late, and anytime dining. Early and late dining is where you go to the main dining room at a set time. For example, we had early dining at 6 p.m. Now, what happens is, you show up to the dining room and you're shown to your table. But the table is often shared with other people. So you can end up sitting with strangers, which is not necessarily a bad thing. Sometimes you make friends. However, what happens is that because there are so many people trying to be served dinner at the exact same time, the quality of the food decreases. So what I mean by that is sometimes you order something like a steak and you ask for it medium rare. And what you find is that either it comes out medium or medium well. And this happened several times for me. It didn't matter if it was a hamburger or a steak or chicken. None of it was cooked the way that I asked for it. One other thing that you should know about dining times is that if you have early dining at 6, for example, you can't change that to late dining during your cruise. It's locked in. Now, what you can do is, you can book anytime dining, which is basically where you go to the dining room and you're seated whenever you want. The problem with anytime dining is that it's extremely hard to get a reservation. So I tried to get a reservation for anytime dining on embarkation day. I started at 7 o'clock in the morning, and I couldn't get a reservation until 9:30 that night. And the next available time slot was until 10:15. So it is very difficult to get a reservation, especially if you want a primetime reservation. The other place where you eat on a cruise ship is at the buffet. Now, the buffet is nice because you can go and you can pick whatever you want. But the problem is that because there's so many people in the buffet at the same time, again, the quality drops. So the food tends to not be as fresh, and sometimes it can be cold. Now, what I recommend doing is if you do want fresh food and you want it to be hot, go early in the morning for breakfast or go later in the evening for dinner. That way you can avoid the crowds and you'll get better quality. Now, some cruise ships have an alternative dining option. So for example, on this particular cruise ship, we had specialty restaurants. These are restaurants that you can pay extra for, and so they're not included in the price of the cruise. Now, the problem with these specialty restaurants is that yes, the food is better, but it's still pretty crowded because they're trying to cram as many people as possible into these restaurants to make more money, so it's not really a solution. Now, the last area that I want to talk about when it comes to crowds is the entertainment area. So on a cruise ship, they have different venues where you can go see a show. And so there's usually a theater. There's sometimes a studio theater. And then there's also lounges where you can go and listen to music. The problem is that when there's so many people on the cruise ship, those venues fill up really fast. So one thing that you can do is you can go early and reserve a seat. However, sometimes those venues have reserved seating, which means that if you go 10 minutes before the show starts and there's still seats available, then they will give you a seat. But if you go 5 minutes before the show starts and there's still seats available, then they will just give those seats away to other people. So my suggestion is that if you do want to go to a show, go as early as you possibly can. If it's a popular show, go half an hour before the show starts to make sure that you get a seat. So overall, my advice for cruising during COVID would be to try to go when fewer people are traveling. So for example, I would definitely avoid going during spring break, summer vacation, Christmas, New Year's, Thanksgiving, Easter. Any of those holidays are going to be extremely busy. You're going to be sharing tables with strangers. You're going to be waiting in long lines for the buffet. And overall, it's just not going to be a very pleasant experience. I would suggest going during the shoulder season or even the off season if you can, because you can get incredible deals. You won't have to share tables with strangers. You won't be waiting in long lines, and you can still have a wonderful time. If you've watched this far, I really appreciate it. And if you haven't subscribed yet, please consider subscribing. I'd love to have you join the community. And if you have any questions about cruising or anything else, please leave them in the comments below. I respond to every single comment. Safe travels. Bye-bye.